Hello and welcome to this review of my DFK-700FI keyboard. Yes, finally, after about 1 billion requests, we're going to look at a Futaba clicky switch keyboard. Datacomp are a veteran keyboard manufacturer who are most well known for a wide range of Alps-based keyboards they made, including this outstanding blue Alps 515AT, which I've reviewed before. And they've recently even announced a series of brand new Alps clones, but they also had some Futaba models. You can often recognize the Futaba models by the rather unique looking keycaps, which I'll come to in a bit, while the Alps models often had more traditional OEM profile Helvetica caps. I've had this keyboard for a while, but unfortunately it doesn't work at all. I'm not sure whether that's because it's electrically buggered or because it speaks some weird protocol, but I suspect it's the former because Datacomp usually made 80 XT boards, and this one even comes with a standard 5-pin DIN plug and AT layout. Regardless, I didn't want to finally do a Futaba keyboard review and then not be able to comment on what the switches are like to use on a day-to-day basis. So I used this Focus 8000 keyboard, which also has Futaba switches, which does work and which I got as a donation. But because I've already done a Focus 8000 review on a model with Alps clone switches, I figured I could use the Focus as a test bed for the switches and comment on them in this video rather than do a separate video on a board I've already reviewed. The irony is that I've been using this Focus for 3 or maybe even 4 weeks in total, much longer than the single week I normally spend on keyboards, and I still am not completely sure what to think of the switches, but we'll get to that later. First, let's look at how the Datacomp is built. Now, Datacomps have a more or less instantly recognizable look. Most of their keyboards, including this one, have a large rounded top bezel and an overall wedge-like shape. Another fairly typical thing for Datacomp keyboards is these little ears, which are spring-loaded and which control the feet. You just rotate them like this, and then they stick in place. Now, the good thing about this design is that it allows you to more easily adjust the feet without turning over the keyboard. The bad thing is that sometimes the feet fall out and get lost. They're a bit reminiscent of the IBM design, which works similarly, but the ears on IBM keyboards are much larger and jut out further, and this causes them to break off in many cases. Those are definitely not liable to fall out though. In fact, the spring holding them here is so strong I couldn't get them out even when I tried. The ears on the Datacomp by comparison are much smaller and more robust though, and I don't think I've ever seen one with broken ones. The keyboard is pretty weighty at just under 1.7 kilos, and it's built very well with a steel back panel. Again, fairly typical for Datacomp, a painted steel mounting plate and a tough plastic top case, as well as a moderately thick coiled cable. It's not quite as monolith-like as the DFK-700FI, but it's a very solid keyboard nonetheless. Now, as for the switches, as I mentioned before, they're Futaba MA series clicky switches, about which I did a teardown video recently. At first sight, they look like a somewhat standard plate spring arrangement, although the plate spring in these might look a bit weird to some, and the switch basically revolves around this plate spring getting inverted. It's very similar to the principle of those jar lids that can flip in or out, and it shares some characteristics with other plate spring designs such as Alps plate spring switches and IBM beam springs. Now, they're clicky and tactile switches, and the most famous thing about these switches is that for some incomprehensible reason they're more clicky and tactile on the upstroke than they are on the downstroke. Here, listen to this. It's been postulated that this occurs because of a warping over time of a rubber insulator at the bottom of the switch, which pushes the plate spring upwards and prevents it from being fully clicky and tactile on the way down. But while this does sound plausible to a degree, the fact that the switch by necessity has more open space at the top than at the bottom after you press it down means that I think it's kind of inevitable that you end up with this result. Regardless, not everyone likes this key field, which I can really only describe as utterly baffling, and I'm still not sure whether I like it or not either, but one thing I'm sure everyone can agree about: these switches are as smooth as room temperature butter, you know, the kind that you can spread very easily. Yummy. Yummy. I think the closest I can come to a decision about these switches is that I actually kind of like them. I mean, they've performed well over the last few months, and I never got sick of using them at all, but the key feels just rather unlike anything else, and therefore a bit hard to compare. Although they have a reputation for being more clicky and tactile on the upstroke, the downstroke is still definitely tactile and in a nice, really sharp way, just as you'd expect from a plate spring driven switch. Harta recorded a false curve of such a switch, and apart from the curve being very smooth, a testament to the switch's smoothness, on every key press you can see that the release curve has a huge set of spikes on the return stroke, which is something that tends to happen on particularly tactile events or when the switch moves a lot. Compare that to the downstroke and you can see it's definitely noticeably more tactile on the upstroke than on the downstroke, like everyone says. The noise is also very weird, which, to be honest, isn't anything out of the ordinary for a plate spring switch. Those tend to sound very unlike other switches, but these ones sound especially tinny. There's also an absolutely insane amount of ping present, although that definitely has something to do with the chassis, as on the Focus it's nowhere near as bad. Overall, it's a pretty balanced switch and very smooth indeed, so if you can look past the strange feel of the return stroke and don't mind the sound too much, I'm sure they'll serve you well, but I can perfectly understand if they're not your bag. Like I said before, I'm still not completely decided myself yet, but I definitely don't hate them at the least. Do note that they use a rather strange 3-pin pinout, so they're not compatible with any other existing PCBs as far as I know. The mount isn't compatible with Cherry MX or Alps and probably many others, and the shells are riveted together so you can't open them without permanent damage to the switches. The switches came in models with two types of mounts. The Datacomp used Futaba's own inverse cross mount, which is the more common of the two, but some Chicone and Focus keyboards, including this 8000, used MX mount, which is fully compatible with MX keycaps, which is always nice of course. That said, on the Datacomp, the native caps are pretty good as well. They're double shot ABS, so the lettering never wears off, and they're definitely very well made. They're rather flat, and although the profile is sculpted, the sculpting is rather subtle and not very significant. They're also fairly thick and have a solid feel of quality about them. They're also quite easy to recognize as the tops have a shape that's somewhat reminiscent of a tombstone, not unlike some older Fujitsu keycaps, but those have a much taller profile and blockier shape. The caps on the Focus are basically the exact same keycaps as the ones on other Focus keyboards, namely thin but tall OEM profile Tai-Hao-like double-shot ABS caps, but instead of the Alps mount these caps normally come with, they use MX mount instead. Now, although these don't enhance the typing sound of Cherry switches as much as the Alps mount versions enhance the sound of Alps switches, they're still pretty decent, and they have colored double-shot modifier legends as well. All in all, this is a pretty decent keyboard. The build quality is excellent, the caps are very nice, if ever so slightly on the weird side, and again, if you don't mind a slightly crazy undertone to your key feel, I'm sure the switches will agree with you as well. Although bizarre in almost every way, there's also a lot to like about them. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard. Yummy. It is yummy. Oh, sorry, wrong scene.